Hello and welcome. Here we are for another episode of Confronting the False Concept of Race. And in this session, I'm going to get a little more personal. I got a little bit personal last time. It's a little awkward to talk about some of those things, but be that as it may. In this episode, we're going to talk about how my genetic heritage exposes the lie of racism. Now, what I'm going to share with you, I'm adapting from an article that I wrote called Pigments of Our Imagination and the Only Blood That Counts, which I wrote around 2018, I believe, and I've adapted it here for this presentation. This is a portion of it. We'll get another section of it later in another episode. All right. I grew up on the fuzzy, flapping fringe of the color line in the United States. Now, I say that because I grew up out west, out in Oregon. All right. My paternal grandmother had 5 generations of Cherokees behind her. Now, that is how they self-identified. I know now that her family and the family of the man that she married were actually Melungeons. Now, that addresses a word that originates in Angola, Africa, and refers to a region there and people from there who were brought to the American colonies in 1619. I'll say some more about that. But they were people who were of African, Native American, and European descent who started in the Jamestown colony of Virginia and went through Appalachia, came through the Cumberland Gap, settled in Kentucky, went into Missouri, Kansas, and all the way across to the West Coast. So my paternal grandparents were both of that kind of stock, African, Native, and European. And other things to talk about. The First Nations people of Canada, who got together with in the case of my grandmother, my paternal grandmother's people, some of them were Scottish, but they were actually Sephardic Jews. And then other French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese ancestors on that line, and also in my maternal lines, which makes me, according to the Canadian Constitution, a Métis. M with an accent on the E, T-I-S. That is a term that refers to people who were of Native, First Nations, and European, mostly French ancestry. But other Europeans were in on that as well. But according to that heritage, under the Canadian Constitution, I am Aboriginal, under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982. I am an Acadian Métis through this combined heritage of both of my parents, and I presently am enrolled with the Coasec Traditional Band of the Abenaki Nation. Now, additionally, in my family, there is knowledge of some Osage heritage in my paternal grandfather's line, as well as Cherokee, Chickahominy, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Nansemond, and actually because of this Melungeon thing and how that all came together, I have hereditary ties to several Native American tribes. My adoptive maternal grandfather was a Louisiana Creole. And I now know that some of my father's lines are connected to that same Creole line, those Creole lines, I should say, of my Grandpa Ducharme, who came out of Lafayette, Louisiana. Now, my biological grandfather on my mother's side, whom I never knew, through his lines, I am Ashkenazi Jewish, along with some Nordic, German, and Scots-Irish, when my grandmother's lines get in on that, and French. It's through my mother that I received genetic markers whose origins are with the Sami people of the Arctic lands and the Ethiopian Jews of Africa. My Y haplogroup, this is my paternal line through my father, is a Sephardic Jewish haplogroup. I descend from Jewish kings, King David on my father's side and Solomon on my mother's side. Well, David and Solomon being related, I get it from both sides. I descend from Ngola Mbandi, Haile Selassie, and other African kings. I descend from several lines of nobility in Europe. I descend from the Sakim Henri Membertou of the Abenaki Mi'kmaq tribe. He was the leader in Nova Scotia who warmly welcomed the first French settlers who came there and let them marry his daughters, and other Native American leaders. One of my ancestors, Edward Sizemore, came from a line of Sephardic Jews out of Spain, whose family came to America via Denmark, and who became a Cherokee chief. So growing up, my closest cultural associations were with Melungeons, Lumbees, half-breeds, that's the word I heard growing up, instead of the word Métis, Cajuns, and Creoles. Because of this, and my own certain awareness, I suppose, I really do not consider myself as white. And I never really have. When I have to mark that little box, I write my own line that simply says, human. Now, Caucasian is what it says on my birth certificate. I had nothing to do with that, and I don't think my parents really did either. It was just the thing that was done. And so, in other words, white. And white is what you would think to call me when you look at me, probably. But white doesn't account for everything, and white seeks to disguise so much. So I don't like the term white, because as a designation for ethnicity, it is really a modern invention and actually a part of this great big lie. And I don't just mean in my case, I mean the use of the term in general. Do you know that when the first Africans arrived in Virginia, now there were others there, I really should qualify that. There were others that had made their way there on their own, but I'm talking about a certain group who were brought there in 1619. Among them were some of my ancestors. Well, did you know that when those people were brought to the colony, there were no white people in Jamestown? Somebody's already thinking, this guy is off his rocker. Yes, there were. John Rolfe, John Smith, all. Yeah. But they weren't called that. That's my point. There were English people in Virginia. There were Europeans. I mean, Jamestown, Virginia was the world in those days. Everybody was there. But they did not think of themselves as or call each other white. In fact, white as a term of social status appears in no records in the American colonies until 1691. So just take those last two digits and flip them. 1619, when my African ancestors came to Virginia, there were no white people in Virginia because that wasn't an official term. Not until 1691 did that become a term on the books. White as an identity had to be carefully taught and manufactured for 6 decades before such a term could be on the books. So, unteaching it and getting it off the books is a great big challenge. So I'm going to go to my ancestors and go down that line from John down to myself, from those Angolans who were brought to Virginia in 1619. So, João Joandago Gawin. Angola was a Portuguese colony. So that was his name of Portuguese derivation, with his last name of African derivation. He was born, we think, in 1616. He may have lived 100 years. He came to serve as a magistrate in the colony of Jamestown. He was one of my African ancestors. He is my 11th great-grandfather. John was 10 years old when the kingdom of Ndongo, in what is present-day Angola, Africa, fell at the hands of the Imbangala, who had been hired by the Portuguese governor Manuel Mendes de Vasconcelos, who hired them to raid that region, enslave its citizens, and seize the kingdom. Little John was 10 years old when this occurred, and he became one of 350 slaves that became cargo on the Japanese-built Spanish galleon, the San Juan Bautista. You can look up this ship, the San Juan Bautista, which was pirated by 2 English corsairs off the coast of what would become Veracruz, Mexico. Those 2 English ships were the White Lion and the Treasurer. You can look them up, the White Lion and the Treasurer. Through a fluke of history, John went from being a slave, part of a slave cargo on a slave ship, to being manipulated evidence in a legal battle between England and the Jamestown colony, and as such one of several Africans who were not only the first to be brought against their will to the colony, but also the ones who were subject to the longest middle passage of any group of Africans that were ever brought over to North America. It's quite a fascinating story. You can look it up. John very, very well may have traveled 10,000 nautical miles before he was eventually settled in Jamestown, where he became an indentured servant and then later became a free man and a full-fledged legal member of the colony. He served many years as a magistrate for the colony, and he may have lived to be 100 years old. There's indication that he did. Now, Margaret Cornish was another one of those that were on the ships. They became, when those 2 English corsairs overtook the Spanish ship, they thought they were going to get gold and silver. Well, they found that it was a cargo of slaves, and they ended up taking 30 of those off of that ship, and then over time those 30 get incorporated into the colony there in Jamestown. Well, Margaret Cornish, as she became known, was another one of those on that ship, and she and John married, and they had a son they named him Mahil. Now, Gawin becomes first Gowen, Gowen. So Mahil, which becomes Michael Gowen, who was born in 1633 and lived to 1717, he was the son of John. And then Mahil had a son named Thomas, born in 1660, lived to 1726. Now, Mahil married a European woman, and then Thomas marries a Cherokee woman. And so William, the son of Thomas, went by William Cherokee Going, and the surname is being spelled Going. by this time in the records. It varies all through the records, one book to the next, 1 year to the next. But William was born in 1680, died in 1725. His son was John Frederick Gowan, Gowan, 1702 to 1762. And then it goes on down to William Shadrach Gowan, 1725-1805, to Daniel Goins, Goins, 1752 to 1810. And that's the spelling that seems to be more predominant. And then Daniel had a daughter named Edith. And Edith marries a man named Byerley. So Edith, born in 1792 to 1860, has a daughter, Rebecca Byerley, born 1806, died 1888. And Rebecca marries a man with the last name of Grindstaff. And then Margaret Grindstaff, their daughter, marries Jacob Fletchall, and their son is Lorenzo Seymour Fletchall. He is the son of Margaret Grindstaff. Lorenzo was born 1869, died 1936, and his daughter was my paternal grandmother, Fern Grace Fletchall. Fern Grace Fletchall is the mother of my father, Tennyson Lee Wright, who was born in 1939 and still is living. Excuse me. So this is my direct line from the Angolan John Gowan, his first wife, Margaret Cornish, who was also one of the, as they are referred to ambiguously in history, the 20 and odd. Their son, Mahil, is my ancestor in this line. And then on it goes, just to let you know a little bit about the heritage of others in the line. Thomas married a Cherokee woman. Then William married a European woman. And in each subsequent generation, this is how it goes. Similar people of similar combinations are marrying each other on down through the family tree. But here is the mix in my family: African, Native American, and European, which actually included people who were Sephardic in origin via Portugal and Spain. And this is my line from Jamestown Colony in Virginia. 400 years ago, plus now, there were no color-based slavery laws. These ancestors came into Virginia as indentured servants, just like the majority of others who came into the colony at that time. These ancestors were free and respected members of the colony after their terms of indenture were fulfilled. It was their descendants who had to deal with the color laws also. There was another one on that ship that I am descended from. His name was Emmanuel Rodriguez, and his name, the surname became Driggers in the colony. And I'm connected to several other Melungeon surnames because all of these Melungeon families married one another. And I do find enslaved blacks among my ancestors. Also, I know that I'm related to Alex Haley and also Martin Luther King Jr. My wife's family comes along similar lines. Both my wife and I come from Melungeon families on our maternal and paternal sides. We are Melungeons. All right. There's a lot of things for you to research there, so I hope you have fun doing so, and I thank you very much for coming and watching this. Please like, comment, and share. Thank you very much. Look forward to more of this, and we will continue, God willing, with a few more of these related to this topic on Wednesdays. All right. Thank you. Bye for now.